When it comes to the laning phase, knowing your matchup is very important to being able to have success in the lane. Today, we're going to be talking about how you can analyze your lane matchups in order to make the most out of them. This topic was suggested by one of you guys in our comments, and I wanted to cover it since everybody has to deal with this at some point in time. Anytime you decide to learn a new champion is released, or a rework is released, you're constantly going to be having to learn new matchups. Right now, we're doing a special Halloween offer for our website. By using code Halloween2019, you can get 50% off your order. So, if you've been on the fence about our website up until this point, now is a great time to try it. Our website has hundreds of guides, all done by challenger players, sorted into a quick and easy to use courses system. We have courses both on the 5 fundamental roles, as well as champion specific courses. So, if that is something that interests you, then make sure to check it out using the link in the description below. So, how can you analyze matchups in order to learn them as quickly as possible? Now, the first and most important thing is you need to actually play the matchup. You're never going to learn the matchup if you never play it. The more times that you can play it, the better, but that's not the only thing that you need to be doing. The first few times that you play a matchup, you're just going to want to be focusing on how trades are going with the enemy champion. In what order did the enemy champion use their spells? Did they come out with a health advantage or a health disadvantage? How quickly did each champion do their damage, and how much CC were they laying down in their combo? Do they have any unique resources or passives that you need to be paying attention to? These are all really important factors that you need to take into account while you are trading, especially in the early game. Just playing the matchup a few times and paying close attention to these specific things will allow you to get a general feel for how the matchup naturally goes. Now, step 2 is, again, very simple. You just want to watch somebody else play the matchup. Now, you can use either YouTube or League of Graphs to find these specific matchups. Personally, I prefer YouTube simply because I don't need to be directing the camera. I only need to be focusing on how the lane matchup itself is going. Now, what's the reason behind us watching somebody else to learn a lane matchup? Shouldn't you just be practicing as much as possible? While yes, practicing is very important, we need to make sure that we're not reinforcing bad habits. This is why we try to watch a professional player, so we can see what they are doing differently. Are they using their abilities in a different order than you did? Are they building different items? Do they use their CC differently? These are all things that you need to pay close attention to. Another thing that you want to determine when watching somebody else play is try to figure out why they are engaging certain trades. What is the trigger? Did Thresh or Blitzcrank miss a hook, for example? Did Jax use his counter-strike on the wave? These are all reasons why somebody might engage a fight. Now, once you've played a few games of the matchup, and you've watched somebody else play the matchup, you should have a decent feel for how this matchup goes at this point. At this point, it's time to show what you learned from watching somebody else play. So, you're going to have to play more games of this matchup. This time, however, the focus is different. Instead of focusing on how the matchup is going, you want to focus on applying all that you've learned up until this point. Make sure that you're performing trades in a way that you already saw was successful, and make sure that you're initiating these trades at a time that you think would be good. Now, in most cases, this means you're going to be starting fights based on the enemy champion's cooldowns, but it's not always true. Some champions do have unique mechanics, for example, Renekton's Fury, that you would be playing around instead. Now, the goal behind playing the matchup again after having watched somebody else play it is you're going to have to redevelop new muscle memory. Your trade patterns are probably going to be different, which means they're going to take practice to relearn. Now, you might be wondering, well, why don't I watch somebody else play and then play the matchup for myself? Playing the matchup before you watch somebody else play it is very important, because if you don't do this, it's very hard to tell what it is that whoever you're watching is doing so well. So at this point, we've played a bunch of the games of the matchup, and we've watched other players. We should be a pro at the matchup at this point, right? Well, not quite. At this point, you should be comfortable with the matchup, but that doesn't mean that you're a pro at it yet. You're going to have to look at your own play a lot more and analyze it a lot further before you're to that level. So then what's the next step? You might have already guessed it, but again, it's going to be play more and watch other people play more. But what exactly are we focusing on this time around? We already know how the trade should be going, what order to use our abilities, and who's going to come out on top. The important thing though, is that champion matchups are not static things. Champion matchups are very volatile and will constantly be changing based on levels, items, any buffs that either champion might have, this is red, blue, dragon buff, or baron buff, or various other outside factors. Now, the buffs and the outside factors portion of this is very hard to control. You don't know what dragons you're going to be getting, you don't know when you might be getting a blue or red buff. You don't know what synergies you're going to have with your own teammates, and you don't know when you're going to be ganked by the enemy jungler or when your jungler is going to gank. For this reason, we want to double down on focusing on the items and the levels. A key concept that you have to understand before you can master any matchup is when champion power spikes naturally occur. This is typically going to be at levels 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 13, 16, and 18. As far as item power spikes go, typically champions spike the hardest on huge completed items like Rabadon's Death Cap or Spear of Shojin. Something else that you should be paying close attention to are active items. Typically these are going to be cheaper and they won't be as big as a Rabadon's Death Cap or a Spear of Shojin, but they will still power spike and they will be an earlier power spike, typically. A simple example of this would be Echo finishing his Proto Belt as his first item. These are a lot more impactful early on into the game because they're basically an entire additional ability. Now the last type of power spike that does exist is a lot more rare, but it is a component or a stat power spike. Now the best example of this is Vladimir stacking early CDR or Kai'Sa getting an early evolve on her Q. A frequent build for Vladimir is he will base and he will get a Fiendish Codex and a Kindle Gem without finishing either of those into an item right away. This is so that he can get as much CDR as possible as early on into the game as possible. Kai'Sa will buy Manamune into Ginsu's Rage Blade. Once the Manamune has stacked enough mana, it will give enough AD so that Kai'Sa can evolve her Q, which is a huge power spike. On certain bruisers, a component like Phage is going to be a pretty big power spike because it allows them to stick on to their target. Again, in most cases, these aren't going to be as impactful as a finished Death Cap or Spear of Shojin, but in some cases they are very, very important. When you are at this stage, you're pretty close to mastering the matchup, and the only thing that's left to do is pay close attention to when these matchups change in favoritism. If the enemy finishes an item and suddenly they win the matchup over you, that's something that you need to take note of. If you hit level 16 and suddenly become unstoppable, like Kassadin for example, this is also something that you really need to take note of. Knowing when matchups change in favoritism is the most important thing for taking advantage of a matchup. You can get a substantial lead in a lane simply by knowing when you start to win a matchup and taking advantage of that. On the other hand, if you don't know that at level 6, suddenly the enemy champion wins the matchup when you've been winning the matchup up until that point, you could throw a huge lead. Most people will only really pay attention to level 6 and how that changes the lane. But again, matchups are volatile and they will change at levels 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 13, 16, and 18. Now once you do get to this point and you understand when each champion has its huge power spikes and when the lane is going to switch in favoritism, then you've really mastered the matchup. The only thing that you can do to push your limits past this point is focus on those outside factors or any buffs that either champion might have. This is again something that's very inconsistent though, and is only something that I would really recommend focusing on if you are one-tricking a champion and pushing it to its absolute limits. Just because you can further analyze any certain matchup doesn't mean you should. Oftentimes your time is going to be better invested in other things at this point. Again, if you're one-tricking, it is a little bit different because you want to be as good at every matchup as possible. That is all that I have for you guys for today's video on how you can analyze matchups. If you haven't already, then make sure to check out our website, GameLeap.com. Right now we're doing a special, and if you use our code Halloween2019, then you will get 50% off your order. If you've been on the fence on whether or not you want to try out our service, now is a great time to give it a shot. We have hundreds of guides, all done by challenger players, sorted into a quick and easy to use courses system. I've checked out a lot of the content on there myself personally, and I can honestly say it is all very high quality. So what are you waiting for? Check us out using the link in the description below. As always, I'm Panther, I hope you learned something valuable, and I will see you in the next one.